The Dracarian Empire stretched across 70 star systems, ruled by creatures who believed themselves the most powerful beings in the galaxy. These dragon-like aliens had conquered worlds, enslaved species, and built monuments to their own greatness. At the heart of this vast empire stood King Vraxis, a massive creature who towered 12 feet tall. His scales were black as midnight, gleaming like polished obsidian under the cold light of 3 moons that hung outside his palace walls. Inside the palace, in a chamber far from the grand halls where the king held court, his son lay alone. Prince Kale was small for a Dracarian child, barely 4 feet long from snout to tail. For 3 long years, the young prince had been unable to move. His legs wouldn't respond to his commands. His wings hung limp against his sides. The royal physicians called it a genetic defect, a flaw in his bloodline that brought terrible shame to the royal family. They had tried every treatment their ancient medical texts prescribed. Rare crystals were placed around his body. Sacred chants were performed. Expensive potions were forced down his throat. Nothing worked. Nothing changed. The prince remained paralyzed, and the empire whispered that perhaps the bloodline was cursed. Rachel Harper didn't care much about empire politics or royal bloodlines. She was just trying to survive her contract. The Terran Labor Guild had shipped her and thousands of other humans across the stars to work as servants in alien households. The pay was decent by Earth standards and it beat the unemployment lines back home. But the work was hard, and the Dracarians made it clear every single day that humans were beneath them. Servants were meant to be seen only when needed and forgotten immediately after. Rachel pushed her cleaning cart down the marble corridor, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. It was late in the evening, well past the time when most of the royal family attended their gatherings in the Great Hall. This was when she did her best work, when no one was around to bark orders or remind her to keep her eyes down. As she approached the prince's chamber, she heard something that made her pause. It was soft at first, almost too quiet to hear. A whimpering sound like a child in distress. Rachel had worked in a children's hospital back on Earth before the economy collapsed. She knew that sound. She knew it deep in her bones. She shouldn't have looked. Every fiber of her training screamed at her to keep walking. The sacred laws of contact were drilled into every human servant from day one. Do not touch Dracarian royalty. Do not speak to them unless spoken to first. Do not even look at them directly if you can help it. The punishment for breaking these laws was severe. She'd heard stories of servants who'd been thrown into prison for months just for accidentally bumping into a minor noble. Touching a member of the royal family? That could mean execution. But Rachel looked anyway. Through the half-open door, she could see the young prince lying on his cushioned platform. His golden eyes were wet with tears. A small toy, something that looked like a carved crystal bird, lay on the floor just inches from his outstretched claws. He was trying desperately to reach it, his small talons scraping against the polished marble, but his body wouldn't cooperate. The frustration and sadness in his eyes broke something inside Rachel's chest. She looked up and down the corridor. Empty. The guards were stationed at the main entrance, not here in the private family wing. Everyone was at the evening gathering. No one would know. Every logical part of her brain told her to walk away. She had 6 more months on her contract. 6 more months and she could go home to Earth with enough money to start over. Breaking the sacred laws would destroy all of that. It would destroy her. But the child was crying. Rachel had never been good at walking away from crying children. She set down her cleaning supplies and stepped into the chamber. The air inside was warm, almost uncomfortably so. Dracarians liked heat. The prince didn't notice her at first, too focused on his impossible task of reaching his toy. Rachel knelt down slowly, picked up the crystal bird, and then did the one thing she absolutely should not have done. She reached out and gently lifted the small dragon into her arms. He was lighter than she expected and warm. His scales felt smooth under her fingers, almost feverish to the touch. She'd expected them to be cold and hard like a lizard's skin, but they were surprisingly soft, almost like touching warm leather. Rachel adjusted her grip carefully, supporting his spine the way she'd been taught to hold human children with muscle weakness. She settled him into a more comfortable position on his cushions and placed the crystal bird within easy reach of his claws. Prince Kale's crying stopped instantly. His luminous golden eyes, still wet with tears, stared up at her with an expression she recognized immediately. It was gratitude mixed with confusion, the look of a child who couldn't quite believe someone had helped them. Rachel's heart clenched. How long had it been since anyone had touched this child with kindness? How long had he been left alone in this room, unable to move, unable to ask for help? She managed a small smile. There you go, little one. That's better, isn't it? The prince made a soft chirping sound, something between a purr and a coo. Then the chamber doors exploded open with a sound like thunder. King Vraxus filled the doorway and Rachel's blood turned to ice. The massive Dragon King's eyes blazed with violet light, a sign of fury so intense it made the air crackle with energy. Behind him, 6 armored guards immediately reached for the plasma weapons at their sides. Their hands moved in perfect unison, trained killers ready to eliminate a threat. Rachel didn't move. She stayed kneeling beside the prince, her hand still resting protectively on his small back. She'd made her choice. There was no running from it now. Explain yourself, human. The king's voice rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder, making the very walls vibrate. You dare violate the sacred laws? Rachel stood slowly, her legs shaking but her resolve firm. She positioned herself between the armed guards and the young prince, knowing full well it wouldn't stop a plasma bolt if they decided to fire. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, but she kept her voice level and calm. Your son needed help. Where I come from, we don't let children suffer alone, law or no law. The guards took a step forward, their weapons now fully drawn and humming with deadly energy. Rachel could see the orange glow of the plasma chambers charging up. This was it. This was how she died on an alien world, for breaking a rule she'd been warned about 1,000 times. But King Vraxus raised one massive claw, and the guards froze mid-step. The Dragon King stood there in the doorway, his enormous frame blocking out the light from the corridor. His violet eyes studied Rachel with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She could see the rage there, yes, but something else too. Something she couldn't quite identify. He tilted his massive head slightly, examining this human who showed no fear, who had broken one of their most sacred laws for a child that wasn't even her species. In Dracarian culture, weakness was shameful. Rachel had learned that much during her months of service. The weak were hidden away in private chambers, kept out of sight so they wouldn't taint the image of strength that the Empire projected. Physical contact with anyone who was sick or disabled was considered taboo, a reminder that perfection could fail. The afflicted were cared for, yes, but at a distance. Always at a distance. Yet King Vraxus couldn't ignore what he'd just witnessed. His son, who cried every evening in this lonely chamber, had stopped the instant this human touched him. The change had been immediate and undeniable. You understand the penalty for what you've done? Vraxus asked, his voice slightly quieter now but no less dangerous. I do, Rachel replied without hesitation. Then you're either the biggest fool in this palace or... He paused, his scaled brow furrowing. What exactly did you do to him? Rachel glanced down at Prince Kale. The young dragon was watching the exchange with wide, alert eyes. She'd seen that look before in children back on Earth, kids who'd been isolated in hospital rooms for too long. They became so hungry for human interaction that they'd focus completely on any conversation happening near them. The prince looked more awake and aware than he probably had in weeks. I held him, Rachel said simply. I comforted him. Gave him what he needed. It's what humans do for children. One of the king's advisors, a smaller Dracarian with dark green scales, leaned in close to whisper urgently in Vraxus's ear. Rachel couldn't hear the exact words but she caught the tone. The advisor was angry, insistent. She must be punished, the advisor hissed loud enough for Rachel to hear. The law demands it. If word spreads that a human violated the sacred laws and walked free, it will undermine everything. But King Vraxus wasn't looking at his advisor. He was looking at his son. The small prince was trembling but not from fear. Rachel recognized it from her years working with children. It was the kind of trembling that came from emotional release, from finally feeling safe after being scared for so long. The child looked peaceful in a way his father had clearly not seen in ages. Rachel knew she had one chance to make this right. One chance to turn her death sentence into something else. She took a breath and spoke before the king could pronounce her fate. Give me 30 days with your son, she said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. 30 days to work with him. If I can't improve his condition, if I fail, then I'll accept whatever punishment you want to give me. Prison, execution, whatever. I won't fight it. Vraxus's eyes narrowed. And if you succeed? Then maybe you'll reconsider what you think you know about lesser species, Rachel said, meeting his gaze directly. It was another violation of protocol. Humans weren't supposed to make eye contact with Dracarian royalty. But she'd already broken the biggest rule. Might as well go all in. If this conversation had happened in the throne room with the full court present, the other nobles would have demanded Rachel's immediate execution for such audacity. The sheer nerve of a human servant making demands of a king, suggesting that the mighty Dracarians might be wrong about something. It would have caused an uproar. But here, in this private chamber with only guards and one advisor present, King Vraxus felt something he rarely experienced: genuine curiosity. Humans had a reputation throughout the Empire. They were stubborn creatures who refused to accept that some situations were hopeless. They kept fighting even when logic said to surrender. It was viewed as a character flaw by most Dracarians, but standing here watching this female defend his son, Vraxus wondered if perhaps there was strength in that stubbornness. 30 rotations, he finally agreed, using the Dracarian term for days. But you'll be watched every moment. Guards will be stationed outside this chamber at all times. Any sign that you're harming him, and the agreement ends immediately. Rachel nodded, relief flooding through her. She'd bought herself time. More importantly, she'd bought the prince time. She turned back to Prince Kale and pulled out her personal medical scanner from her pocket. It was a small device, nothing fancy, just standard Earth medical technology that most humans carried. The Dracarians had actually banned human medical devices from the palace, calling them primitive and unreliable compared to their advanced systems. But Rachel had hidden hers in her quarters just in case. She powered it on and ran it slowly over the prince's small body, watching the readouts carefully. King Vraxus moved closer, watching her work with those intense violet eyes. His guards remained ready, hands still on their weapons. After several minutes of scanning, checking and rechecking the data, Rachel looked up at the king. Her expression was serious. "Your physicians missed something important," she said. "This isn't just genetic paralysis. There's significant neurological damage here, but it's not from birth defects." Vraxus's scales rippled, a physical response that Rachel had learned indicated shock or strong emotion. "That's impossible. Our medical technology is the most advanced in this sector." "Your technology is advanced for treating injuries and diseases," Rachel agreed. "But this is different. Your son has neurological damage from prolonged isolation and sensory deprivation. His body didn't just fail randomly. It shut down because his mind believed no one cared whether he moved or not." The king stared at her as if she'd just spoken in an alien language. "You're saying his mind caused this?" "On Earth, we learned this truth centuries ago," Rachel said, her fingers moving gently over the prince's spine, checking for responses. "Isolation kills. It doesn't just hurt mentally, it causes real physical damage, especially in children. Connection heals. Touch heals. Hope heals. Your son doesn't just need medicine and crystals and potions. He needs someone to care about him. He needs hope that things can get better." Day 5 arrived with the morning light filtering through the tall palace windows. Amy lifted Prince Kale carefully, supporting his small weight in her arms as she began the morning exercises. She'd created a routine based on her years working with children back on Earth. Gentle movements, constant encouragement, and most importantly, never-ending conversation. "All right, little guy, let's try moving this leg again," she said softly, carefully manipulating his left hind leg in small circular motions. "You know, back on Earth I worked with a kid named Tommy. He was about your age, couldn't walk after an accident. Everyone said he'd never move again. But you know what? Within 6 months he was running around the playground." Prince Kale's golden eyes watched her face intently as she spoke. Amy had noticed this from the first day. The young dragon drank in every word, every story, as if he'd been starving for interaction. She told him about Earth cities, about oceans and mountains, about human children who'd faced impossible odds and won. She told him about a species that had one defining characteristic: they never gave up on anyone. Behind the observation glass, King Vraxus stood watching. This had become his daily ritual, though he'd never admit it to anyone. He would come here each morning supposedly to check on security protocols, but really to watch the human work with his son. His advisors had complained multiple times that the king was wasting precious time watching a servant perform dubious medical procedures. Vraxus had silenced them with a single look. No one questioned him after that. The human's methods seemed completely absurd by Dracarian standards. She touched his son constantly, something that made the king uncomfortable at first. Her hands were always on Kale, adjusting his limbs, massaging his muscles, checking his spine. When the prince got frustrated and his eyes would dim with sadness, Amy would pull him into an embrace, holding him close and whispering encouragements. She sang strange human songs in a language Vraxus didn't understand. She played simple games, making funny sounds and silly faces that made Kale's eyes brighten. It all seemed so unscientific, so emotional, so beneath the dignity of royal medical treatment. Yet the king couldn't argue with what he was seeing. By day 12, the changes were undeniable. Prince Kale's scales had transformed from dull gray to lustrous silver. They caught the light now, shimmering with health. His eyes tracked movement across the room, following Amy wherever she went. Most surprisingly, he'd started making sounds, not just the pitiful crying Vraxis had grown accustomed to, but curious chirps and trills. The sounds of a child who was interested in the world around him. On the morning of day 13, Vraxis entered the chamber unexpectedly. Amy looked up from where she sat cross-legged on the floor, Prince Kale resting comfortably in her lap while she read from a data pad showing pictures of Earth animals. "What you're doing," the king said, his deep voice filling the room, "our physicians say it has no scientific basis." Amy set down the data pad and met his eyes. "Your physicians treat bodies. Humans learned a long time ago to treat people. There's a big difference." "Explain this difference." It wasn't really a request. Amy gestured to the young prince in her lap. "Look at him. Your culture sees his condition as shameful, right? So he was kept isolated. No touch, no real interaction, no mental stimulation. His brain is smart, it adapted to the situation. It shut down non-essential functions to conserve energy. Movement became non-essential because nobody responded when he tried to move. Why waste energy on something that doesn't matter?" Vraxis's tail lashed behind him, a sign of agitation. "You're saying we caused this? That our culture made my son's condition worse?" "I'm saying isolation made it significantly worse," Amy replied, keeping her tone gentle but honest. "On Earth we have a saying, use it or lose it. Bodies need purpose to function. Brains need connection to thrive. Your son lost both when he was hidden away." The king said nothing, but Amy could see the conflict in his eyes. Day 18 brought something Amy had been hoping for but didn't dare expect so soon. She was telling Prince Kale a story about Earth's ancient dragons, the mythical creatures from human legends, when she saw it. His tail twitched. Not a random spasm, but a deliberate movement in response to an exciting part of the story. Amy's breath caught in her throat. "Kale? Can you do that again?" The prince's tail moved again, this time in a clear side-to-side motion. "Guards!" Amy shouted toward the door. "Get the king. Now." Vraxis arrived within minutes, having been in a nearby meeting. He entered to find Amy kneeling beside his son, tears streaming down her face, while Prince Kale deliberately moved his tail in slow, controlled patterns. The Dragon King stood frozen in the doorway. He'd been told this was impossible. 3 years of the Empire's best physicians had confirmed it. Genetic paralysis was permanent, irreversible. Yet here was his son, moving with clear intention, responding to commands from the human. How? The word came out barely above a whisper. Amy wiped her eyes and smiled up at him. Because someone finally told him he was worth fighting for. Because he has a reason to move now, someone responds when he does it. The days continued. By day 22, Prince Kale could lift his head on his own. By day 25 he could grip objects with his small claws. Amy would offer him her finger and he'd wrap his claws around it, holding on tight while she moved around the room. He refused to let go, as if afraid she might disappear. The palace physicians came every day now, running their scans and tests. Their instruments confirmed what their eyes could barely process. The prince was healing in ways that shouldn't be possible according to everything they understood about Dracarian biology. Amy pulled up her personal files from Earth on her data pad. She showed Vraxis case after case. Human children recovering from paralysis through early intervention, physical therapy, and emotional support. The medical journals had titles like The Mind-Body Connection in Pediatric Recovery and Emotional Wellness as a Factor in Physical Healing. "We discovered something your medicine hasn't fully explored," Amy explained as Vraxis scrolled through the files late one night. "The mind and body aren't separate systems. They're connected in ways we're still learning about. Heal one and you help heal the other. Your medicine treats symptoms with precision. Human medicine tries to treat the whole person, body, mind, and spirit together." Vraxis studied the data for hours after Amy had left for the evening. The human medical approach seemed chaotic compared to Dracarian precision. It relied heavily on things that couldn't be easily measured. Hope, connection, emotional wellness. Things his culture had dismissed as irrelevant to physical health. Yet the success rates were there in black and white. In cases like his son's, human methods achieved recovery percentages that Dracarian medicine could only dream of. For the first time in his long life, King Vraxis began to question everything he'd been taught about the lesser species. Perhaps they weren't lesser at all. Day 29 arrived with tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Prince Kale could now move 3 of his 4 limbs with increasing control. His progress was remarkable, even miraculous by Dracarian medical standards. But this miracle had created a storm throughout the palace. The servants whispered in hallways. The nobles argued in private chambers. Some saw the prince's recovery as a blessing, proof that the royal bloodline was stronger than anyone had believed. Others saw it as something much darker, contamination by an inferior species, a stain on Dracarian purity that could never be washed away. Amy was helping Kale with his morning gripping exercises, placing small objects in his claws and encouraging him to hold them, when the chamber doors suddenly burst open with a thunderous crash. 3 figures swept into the room, their ceremonial robes flowing behind them like dark wings. Amy recognized them immediately, members of the traditional council, the guardians of Dracarian culture and purity. These were the old ones, the dragons who believed that the ancient ways were the only ways, who saw any change as a threat to everything they held sacred. The lead counselor was an ancient Dracarian with scales so dark they were almost black, his eyes cold as ice. He looked at Amy with pure disgust before turning his gaze to the young prince. "This abomination must end immediately," he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "The prince's recovery taints our bloodline. He has been touched by human hands, corrupted by their weakness-centered philosophy. This is not healing, it is contamination." Amy felt her blood run cold, but she didn't hesitate. She stepped directly in front of Prince Kale, placing herself between the council members and the child. "Get out," she said firmly. The counselor's eyes widened in shock. "You dare speak to?" "I dare," Amy interrupted, her voice carrying a steel that surprised even herself. "This child has suffered enough for 3 lifetimes. You will not come in here and shame him for getting better. You will not make him feel broken again. Now get out of this room." The confrontation was loud enough to draw attention from across the palace wing. Within moments, King Vraxus arrived with his personal guards, his massive presence filling the doorway. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Explain this intrusion," the king demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. The lead counselor bowed stiffly, though his face showed no real respect. "Your Majesty, we come to petition for this human's immediate removal. Her methods undermine the very foundations of our culture. If word spreads throughout the empire that we needed human help to heal one of our own, it will be seen as weakness. Our enemies will." "My son is healing," Vraxus cut him off, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble that made even his guards step back. "You would sacrifice that for pride? It's not about pride, Majesty. It's about preservation. About maintaining what makes us Dracarian. Humans are inferior beings, and to admit that they possess knowledge we lack." An explosion ripped through the outer wall. The blast was deafening, shaking the entire chamber. Stone and metal erupted inward in a shower of debris. Before anyone could react, 3 figures in black tactical gear burst through the smoking hole, plasma weapons already raised and glowing with lethal energy. Amy's training from her years in emergency medicine kicked in instantly. Her eyes caught the insignia on their armor, a twisted symbol she'd seen before in intelligence briefings. The Purity Movement. Extremists who believed that any compromise of Dracarian traditional values was blasphemy worthy of death. They saw Prince Kale's recovery through human methods as the ultimate betrayal. Time seemed to slow down to a crawl. Amy watched the lead assassin's weapon track across the room, the barrel swinging toward Prince Kale. She saw the muscles in his arm tense. Saw his finger begin to squeeze the trigger. Saw King Vraxus on the far side of the room, too far away to reach his son in time. Amy didn't think. She just moved. She threw herself across Prince Kale's small body, wrapping herself around him like a shield. The plasma bolt that would have pierced the young prince's heart struck her back instead. The pain was beyond anything she'd ever imagined, like being hit by lightning and burned alive at the same time. The smell of her own burning flesh filled her nostrils, making her stomach heave. She heard King Vraxus roar with a fury that shook the palace foundations. Heard plasma weapons fire from the guards. Heard bodies hitting the floor with heavy thuds as the assassins were cut down. Then there were hands, massive, scaled hands that somehow managed to be gentle, lifting her carefully. King Vraxus's face filled her vision, and for the first time since she'd met him, Amy saw genuine fear in those violet eyes. "Amy," he said, and his voice actually cracked on her name. "What? Why would you do this?" Amy coughed, tasting blood in her mouth. Below her, she could hear Prince Kale crying, his small claws reaching up desperately toward her. Every breath felt like knives in her lungs, but she managed to speak. "Because," she gasped, "that's what humans do. We protect the ones we love." The word love hung in the air like something physical. The Dracarian language had no real equivalent for it. They had words for loyalty, for duty, for honor and obligation. But love? That messy, irrational, overwhelming human emotion? That was considered a weakness, a flaw in human psychology that made them soft. Amy's vision started to blur, darkness creeping in at the edges. She fought to stay conscious. "My medkit," she managed to say. "Blue pouch, in my bag. Trauma gel, apply it directly to the wound. Pressure bandage, you have to seal the edges." Even while dying, even with her back torn open by plasma fire, she was still teaching them. Still trying to help. Vraxis barked orders at his physicians, who scrambled to find Amy's bag and follow her instructions exactly. The human medical supplies that had been banned from the palace as primitive and unreliable were now the only thing that might save her life. Then something happened that made everyone in the room freeze. Prince Kale was moving. Not the small, controlled movements they'd been practicing. This was different. The young prince dragged himself forward using all his limbs, driven by pure determination and something deeper. He moved independently for the first time in years, pulling himself across the floor until he reached Amy's side. He pressed his small head against her uninjured shoulder, making sounds of distress that broke everyone's heart. "I'm okay, sweetheart," Amy whispered, her hand finding his head and stroking gently. "You're safe. That's all that matters." Vraxis watched this scene unfold before him. Watched a human prioritize his son's safety over her own survival. Watched his son move through sheer force of will to comfort someone who'd shown him kindness. Watched as two beings from completely different species shared something his culture had forbidden and denied: genuine connection. In that moment, everything King Vraxis had been taught, everything he believed about humanity and strength and what made a species superior, it all shattered completely. 3 months had passed since the attack. Beth stood on the palace balcony, feeling the cool breeze against her skin. Her back still bore the scars from that plasma blast, thick, raised tissue that would never fully heal. The palace physicians had done their best, but some wounds left permanent marks. She didn't mind. Every time she felt the tightness in her scarred skin, she remembered why she'd earned them. Below the balcony, the entire Dracarian High Council was gathering. Hundreds of the most powerful beings in the Empire filled the vast courtyard, their scales glittering in the sunlight like a sea of jewels. This was an unprecedented assembly. The last time the full council had been called together was over 50 years ago. Prince Kale stood beside Beth, his small hand gripping hers tightly. He could walk now, though his steps were still a bit unsteady. His wings worked, his limbs responded, and his eyes shone with life and curiosity. Every day he grew stronger. But he refused to let go of Beth's hand as they walked into the throne room together. She was his security blanket, his proof that the world could be kind. King Vraxis stood at the center of the massive chamber, his presence commanding absolute attention. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the room without need for amplification. 3 months ago, he began, I believed I understood what strength meant. I thought I knew what power was. What superiority looked like. He turned and gestured toward Beth and his son. Then a human woman broke our oldest and most sacred law to help my child. She risked execution without hesitation. Days later, she threw herself in front of a plasma weapon to save him. And in doing these things, she taught me the greatest lesson of my entire reign. Murmurs rippled through the assembled council members. Some nodded in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably, their faces showing clear disapproval. Vraxis continued, his voice growing stronger. For thousands of years, we Dracarians have prided ourselves on our strength, our physical might, our military dominance, our technological superiority. We've built an empire on these pillars, and we've looked down on species who didn't measure up to our standards. He paused, letting his words sink in. But we've been measuring superiority incorrectly this entire time. His gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of the most powerful leaders in Dracarian space. True strength isn't the power to conquer others. It isn't about how many worlds you control or how many enemies you can defeat. True strength is the courage to care for someone, even when caring makes you vulnerable. Even when it costs you everything. Beth felt Vraxis's massive claw rest gently on her shoulder. The weight was significant, but the gesture was protective, almost paternal. Humanity's real strength lies in their absolute refusal to abandon anyone, the king said. Their medicine heals where ours fails because they treat the whole being, body, mind, and spirit together. Their courage shows itself not in battle, but in defending others at personal cost. Their greatest innovations don't come from competition and domination. They come from cooperation and genuine care for each other. Prince Kale suddenly stepped forward, his young voice surprisingly clear and strong. I was dying, he said, and the entire room fell silent. Not just my body, my spirit was dying too. The isolation was killing me faster than any disease. Beth gave me something all your advanced medicine never could. She gave me hope. She gave me connection. She gave me something you don't even have a word for, love. The throne room erupted. Traditionalists jumped to their feet, shouting protests. How dare the prince speak such heresy? How dare he claim human emotions were superior to Dracarian values? Moderates shouted back, defending the prince's words. The chamber descended into complete chaos, dozens of arguments breaking out simultaneously. King Vraxus's roar shook the very foundations of the palace. Everyone fell silent instantly. Effective immediately, he declared, his voice leaving no room for argument, the sacred laws of contact are abolished. They are outdated, harmful, and will no longer be enforced anywhere in this empire. Humanity will be recognized as equal partners, not servants. Our medical practices will incorporate their methodologies and philosophy. And anyone, his eyes blazed with violet fire, anyone who attempts violence against those who heal rather than harm will answer to me personally. The declaration hit Dracarian space like a shockwave. Within a week, 6 colonies on the Outer Rim declared independence, unwilling to accept these radical changes. 8 other colonies immediately petitioned to join the new order, seeing it as progress long overdue. The empire fractured along ideological lines, those who desperately clung to the old ways, and those who embraced what one human had proven possible. But King Vraxus never wavered. Not once. 5 years later, Prince Kale soared through the corridors of the first human Dracarian medical academy, his wings strong and sure. He'd grown into a confident young dragon, though still smaller than most his age. He was demonstrating flight techniques to a group of struggling students, offering the same patient encouragement Beth had once shown him. Beth herself now served as Dean of Pediatric Care. Her lectures were always packed, filled with students from a dozen different species, all eager to learn the human approach to medicine. During the Academy's dedication ceremony, a young journalist approached Beth with a question that had been on many minds. Why did you risk everything for an alien child who couldn't even thank you at the time? Beth smiled, watching Kale work with his students across the courtyard. He was so patient with them, so encouraging, mirroring exactly what she'd once given him. He needed help, she said simply. Someone had to care enough to actually do something. That's not bravery. That's just being human. King Vraxus stood nearby and overheard her words. That, he said quietly though his voice carried weight, is precisely what makes them extraordinary. The Dragon King had finally learned what humans had always known. The strongest empires, the ones that truly lasted, weren't built on dominance and fear. They were built on the courage to lift up those who had fallen. Sometimes the smallest act of genuine compassion could reshape entire civilizations. Beth had simply lifted a paralyzed prince when everyone else had walked away. In doing so, she'd lifted an empire's understanding of what actually made a species superior. Not scales or claws. Not weapons or ancient pride. Not even advanced technology. But the simple, revolutionary act of caring for someone, even when all the rules said to look away. That was humanity's true gift to the galaxy. And the Dracarian Empire would never be the same.